So the idea of a license, and most copyright licenses look kind of like this. They'll say copyright, all rights reserved. This license basically means don't touch my stuff. Okay? All rights reserved means this belongs to me, you use it, you get sued. And that's what it means. Now usually if you pay the copyright owner money, so suppose you pony up $100 for their shrink wrap software, then they'll give you a license to use it, which means you have non-transferable exclusive rights to utilize this software. Did you know that when you buy software, you don't own the software? You're actually licensing the software, which means that you cannot buy software. You cannot own software. All you can do is pay the copyright owner for the privilege of using the software. And they'll usually tell you you can't give it to your friend. Did you know even if you give them the original package with the original discs and you retain no copies for yourself, you cannot give it to your friend unless it says in the license, you may transfer it. Has anybody ever read one of those massive 20-page copyright things? That's the other thing. Nobody reads them anymore, so nobody has any idea what their rights are. And so copyright law is kind of funky and messy. If you want to give your work away for free, well, let's go. So how can I do this? Long ago, AT&T bought Unix. Unix was this startup operating system that they had invented this language called C so that they could write Unix. They were writing an operating system for these new computers. At some point, there was a bunch of legal stuff. I can't remember. They were maybe broken up as a monopoly, or maybe before then. For some reason, Unix forked, and there was a flavor of Unix called BSD, which became free. And they basically invented this BSD license, the Berkeley software distribution. I guess maybe it was Berkeley, California, University of Berkeley started maintaining their own distribution of Unix. And they added a license to it that basically said everybody can use this. So the BSD license essentially says, while we still retain the copyright, we're giving away all the rights and everybody can copy this software. And in many ways, that was sort of the birth of this idea that, hey, you can just take our license and slap it on your code and suddenly everybody can use it. The problem with the BSD license is this. A lot of other companies took the BSD code and said, well, thanks for giving it to us. And then they improved it and kept those improvements closed source and said, we own these improvements, they're only ours, nobody touch it or we'll sue you. And so basically, distributing stuff under the BSD license was telling everybody in the world they could use your stuff and not pay you back for it. You see how that kind of doesn't feel right? And while this is the most open way that anyone had ever yet distributed their software, it kept getting closed back up by every proprietary company that wanted to use it. Yes?
The user license agreement, though, you can't override federal law with that, right?
That's correct. So the federal law says the person who created the work gets to control who has ownership of it. Now, if you are the person who created the work and you write this license, that's you explicitly giving permission for somebody to copy it. So that's not a violation of federal law, or it's not changing it. If you write in the license, you have to give me your firstborn son, and you have to poke yourself in the eye with the poison needle, there's no reason they have to do that at all, because you can't write laws. The only thing you can do is authorize them to copy your software. So you cannot add things to the license beyond the law. All you can do is waive the rights you already have. So you have the right to control your work. This guy, yeah, I know. Don't look too hard. Smart guy, but man, he doesn't have the best style. Anyway, he was working at MIT, and he had a printer, and he wanted to make his printer work on his operating system, and he couldn't do it. So he called up the printer manufacturer and said, hey, I need the source code to your drivers so I can make your stuff better. They said no. That's our proprietary software. That's our bread and butter. You're not touching it. And you do, we'll sue you. And it's a weird attitude to take because he wanted to write free software for them that would improve their printer and make it work on more operating systems. And he said, look, I'll give it to you. I just want to make my printer work in my stupid lab, right? And I don't know if this is very accurate. This is my vague impression of the story. So go read the real story before you start repeating this. But let me try to give you a vague impression of what happened. He got in a big fight with the printer company. They had a legal team because that's what big companies have. And the legal team didn't want to be chewed out by their CEO. So they did a CYA thing and basically offered no rights to Richard Stallman. Even though he had bought and paid for this printer, he couldn't make it work on his operating system. And he decided that's just immoral and wrong. So he found a friend named, what was that guy's name? Eben Moglin or something like that, Eben Moglin, who happened to be a law professor at Columbia University. Well, they got together and he said, hey, help me figure out how to defeat copyright law. They got a big problem here. Well, they put their heads together and came up with something called the General Public License. And the idea of the General Public License is this. It says to the world, oh, it's a good picture to look at. There's Richard Stallman talking about it. By the way, if you want to see a funny... If you Google YouTube for Richard Stallman videos, there's a whole bunch of really funny ones. He just gets out on stage and he's such a hippie. There's one where he actually sits there and he starts in the middle of he's just lecturing, and in the middle of it, he takes off his sock, grabs something from between his toes and puts it in his mouth, and he still just keeps on going. Funniest guy. Anyway, I shouldn't have said that. Yeah. But here's the idea of the GPL. General Public License. We will grant to you license to use our software if, and only if, you meet the following conditions. And these conditions are, whatever improvements you make to the software, you have to give them away for free and redistribute them under the GPL. Do you get it? If the GPL had added new things like, and you have to stick a poison needle in your eye, that wouldn't be enforceable because the GPL cannot tell you you have to do anything. You don't have to do anything. What the GPL is doing is it's saying, nanny, nanny, new, we're not going to give you a license to use the software unless you meet our conditions. Do you see how that's not adding to the law? It's just conditionally detracting from it. So in very simple terms, the GPL says something along the lines of, if you share all your improvements, and you don't necessarily even have to make any, then you have unlimited license to this work. Turns out there are all kinds of precedences of similar things in the law, and so while no one had really thought of it before, the GPL suddenly became a really popular thing. Richard Stallman was working on a new operating system he called GNU, or GNU. Maybe it's just pronounced new, I don't know. It's named after that buffalo thing that roams the plains of Africa. The only thing he was missing was a kernel, which is basically the most important central part of the operating system, till a guy named Linus Torvalds comes along. That's this guy. Linus Torvalds says, well, he writes a kernel and distributes it under the general public license, gives it away to the world as long as they share their improvements. And he named his operating system after himself, and he called it Linux because his name was Linus, or Linux. And that became Linux, and basically the Linux kernel with the GNU tools, such things as G++ and VI or Emacs and all the tools that come on Linux that make it Linux, plus a lot of the Unix foundations that came out of AT&T, they all kind of fused together and became the operating system known as Linux. Because Linux is free to the world, anyone can improve it, but it can't really be closed up because anybody that improves it has to give away their improvements for free. Linux started spreading like wildfire, and all of a sudden the Free Software Foundation was born, which these two guys started, and then a bunch of people that didn't like the idea of free software came up with a new term called open source, and for some reason that word took hold a little better because the term open source includes licenses beyond the general public license. It includes the BSD license, which is more free, although it doesn't keep the software free as well as the GPL does, and a lot of other licenses that let you use the source. So open source software was born, and all of a sudden proprietary companies are panicking. So at that time, Microsoft was kind of the central representative of proprietary software. And Linux, they made, of course, Windows, and Linux became the symbolic representative of open source software. So Microsoft had a bunch of money from all of their proprietary works. In fact, they were bringing in something like 80% of all money ever globally sold for shrink-wrapped software at the time, in the height of their dominance. They were bringing in a huge fortune of money, and they threw a whole bunch of weight behind securing copyright law and promoting the idea that open source is evil and so forth. Meanwhile, the general public license caused Linux to march on, and a lot of people contributed to it, and they formed two major factions, and the world now seems to be divided between people that believe in proprietary software and people that believe in open source software. And as it happens, it's looking like the open source is very slowly crushing the proprietary system, and it looks like Android is going to become one of the dominant operating systems, and Windows is just starting to lose its hold, but Windows is still dominant on the desktop by a huge margin, yet Linux is dominant on servers and on phones, if you count Android as a Linux variant. Google built Android on top of Linux, and I don't know, lots of stuff is happening. Here's the advantage of open source software. Many people get to look at the source, which makes it more secure. It also is free. You don't usually have to pay for open source software, and it's free in that you can update it. Proprietary software, you take their word for it, but you have a company to fall back on. You're paying them money, so you can yell at somebody if it doesn't meet your specifications. You usually feel like you have some right to customer service, which they never provide anyway, but there you go. Open source and free software are both things, and you can make whatever kind you want, but unless you stick a license on your software, it is by default copyright, all rights reserved. Okay? And if you stick something on the web, it's copyright, all rights reserved unless you have a license. If you look at some software, CRS paradigms, let's see. Well, maybe. Let's see. I'm looking at some code that I gave you. What did I do? Stop that. Why am I split window? Control-Shift-R? Here we go. It is automatically copyrighted, and technically no one can copy it. However, fair use. If you're only copying 5 lines of code, pretty sure that falls under fair use domain and nobody would waste their time suing you. Legally they could, so yeah, copyright law is a mess. Notice this is a file I distributed to you. Look at the top. What's the license? I didn't add one. I neglected to. That means if you use this code, I sue you. Okay, I won't sue you. I don't care. That was my mistake. I should have put a license there. Let's find a different one. Let's see, KJSON. Here's another file I gave you. Look at the top of this one. The contents of this file are distributed under the CC0 license. See this URL. So here's a URL. What is the CC0 license? The person who associated this work has dedicated the work to the public domain by waiving all of his or her rights. It's actually impossible to put a work in the public domain, but This organization called Creative Commons, they kind of followed on the heels of the open source movement, and they said, well, wait a minute, it's not just about software, it's also artistic things and everything. So they made very general purpose licenses that you can stick on anything. CC0 is one of my favorite licenses. It basically says, I don't care, do whatever you want. And so I like to use the CC0 license on all my work. That means if you want to take my code and put it in and make it open source, go for it. If you want to take my code and make it proprietary and start a company, cool, I don't care. This license says, I don't give a darn. There's another version of it, which I also kind of like, is the WTFPL. This one says it a little more colorfully. I don't know if this is legal, so I would go with the CC0 license just to be sure. But it says, this is the length of the entire license. Okay. And they put a W in a funny circle just to make fun of copyright law. This is basically just saying copyright law is stupid. Here's the dignified way of saying, I don't want copyright. Go away, copyright. Okay? But if you do this, some company, some proprietary company that's going to make money off your software can take it and use it and not give you a penny of retribution. If you don't like that, maybe what you actually want is the GPL license. Or if you prefer the Creative Commons licenses, which are more for general works and not just software, let's go to Creative Commons. Basically, you go to here, and they probably have a wizard that helps you pick your license. Share your work. Let's try that. Choose the features. Let's get started. Okay. Do you want to allow adaptions of your work to be shared? Yes. Do you want to allow commercial uses of your work? I don't know. How about no? Do you want people to be forced to give you attribution? Meaning if they use it, do they have to recognize your name? And then you finally somewhere say yes, and they'll tell you what license to use. I don't know where I click finish. Well, who cares? You can figure it out if you want to. But here's the deal. A lot of people write their own licenses on the tops of files, and lawyers come along and say, not a valid license because section 42CB3, paragraph 1, clause 7 says blah, and their licenses fall apart. So the moral is, don't write your own licenses. There are lots of good licenses out there. Get one that's well established and stick it on the top of all your code. It's now common practice at the top of every file you ever write to have a line that states the license of the code. I strongly recommend you do that, because if you don't, then your code is unlicensed, and then it falls to the default, which is you get to charge whatever you want for people to use one copy of your code. And it's kind of important to have a license at the top of your code, even if it's proprietary. Even if it is, you still want to say, all rights reserved, because that makes it clear to people that, hey, don't touch my junk. If you want to be annoying and ambiguous, don't have a license at the top of your code, and then somebody sees it and they always wonder, am I going to use it? Are they going to sue me? What's going on? And that's the thing. So as a good computer programmer, always put a license at the top of your code.